So for all of you to come out tonight, I think at the end of the night, you're going to say, bearing the cold, it pales in comparison to what James Dockery did for his country and his neighbors. Thank you to the Veterans Park Partnership that does great work, particularly cataloging history in a very important area, those who served our country and those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. I want to thank Anthony Maricola from the library, Colleen, of course, Rick, who was here before, and please, by show of hands, the family of James Dockery. Whose family? God bless you. That's the family of James. So I'm pleased and proud tonight to speak before you in honor of Black History Month, in particular to talk about one of Stamford's most important citizens, James Edward Eddie Dockery. I'd like to, if you would just indulge me for a minute before I talk about James Dockery, I would like to say that Stamford has a very rich history, particularly when we talk about those who serve their country. From the colonial times to the present, Black servicemen and women from Stamford have fought and died in all of our country's wars. The rich history of service and sacrifice has been enormous. As far back as the American Revolution. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. How's that? Okay. As far back as the American Revolution, local Black citizens volunteered in droves to serve the cause. One such man I'd like to talk about first. And you heard the term, you can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. You're going to see if I can talk and do this at the same time. Obviously, I can't. There we are. There he is. One such citizen was Sam Bush of Stamford. Sam Bush served directly under George Washington, directly under him, and stayed with him from the beginning of the war to the end. Not many people could say that. More significantly, Washington took a liking to him, and at the conclusion of the war, Washington felt so strongly about Bush that he personally signed Bush's discharge papers, advising him, and this is a quote from George Washington, "Take this and keep it with care. It may someday be of use to you." Now, that's an understatement, isn't it? It may someday be of use to you. Well, he did have to use that. He had to use that to ultimately collect his pension after the war. And as you can imagine, that original signature of Washington was of great value. During the Civil War and later during World War I, Black citizens fought and died in places like Gettysburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville. In World War I, Chateau Thierry and the Argonne Forest. During World War II, a rich history during World War II. By the way, the discharge. During World War II, Stanford High graduate Reed Thompson, who was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for, Colleen's giving me the signal, the Distinguished Flying Cross for taking out a German depot. Reed Thompson was a member of the elite Tuskegee Airmen from Stanford. During the war in Vietnam, the 5 Hunter brothers. Now, during World War II, 7 DePretta brothers served, but it was a war that was incredibly large in scale. World War II, 7 DePretta brothers. The Vietnam War, 5 Hunter brothers, unheard of. And not only did the Hunter brothers serve during the Vietnam War, they served in Vietnam. And when my son and I were dealing with them, we figured out that between 1965 and 1971, there was at least 1 and most times 2 Hunter brothers in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam. Incredible story. One needs to look no further than the memorial wall to, there we go. One needs, There we go. If you look at the memorial wall, there are scores of black citizens who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. World War II, Winston Statewhite, they called him Winston Sally White. There was later a VFW post named after him. In Vietnam, Eugene Mansell and Isaac Sapp also gave their lives during the Vietnam. But today, we're here to talk about an extraordinary citizen of Stamford, James Eddie Dockery. His story was of national significance and one that also has tremendous meaning to me personally. It's a story that speaks so much to both the darkness and the greatness of our nation. This is it's a story of paradox. It's a story of a quiet, humble, unpretentious man who at a critical time in our history was called upon to transcend customary human behavior. And acting with extraordinary heroism, he saved the lives of countless men. He then returned home, quietly resumed his life, and then patiently waited and waited and waited and waited for some 50 years for his legacy to be realized. So let's talk for a minute about James Eddie. James Dockery was born in North Carolina in the early 20th century as part of the Great Migration. Dockery and his family, seeking opportunity, moved to the Northeast, first to New Jersey and later to Stamford, Connecticut. Upon America's entry into World War II, Dockery was 35 years old. 35 years old, when the average age was somewhere around 21. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy and was assigned to the Intrepid. Kyle, I'm going to have you do this because I'm not. Right? It's only hitting about 50%. He was assigned to the USS Intrepid, which would become one of the most iconic ships in American history. The Intrepid was an Essex-class aircraft carrier, which was home to some 2,600 officers and enlisted men. It was launched in 1943, and the ship would ultimately participate in epic battles in the Pacific, including the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the Battle for the Philippines. And despite suffering heavy damage throughout the war, most from kamikazes, it would survive to serve in the war in Vietnam, as well as serving as a recovery ship for the NASA program in the early 60s for our space program. As hard as it is to fathom today, while the United States was fighting a war against regimes that practiced the worst forms of racism and anti-Semitism, our own military practiced rigid segregation. On the battlefield in the Army, the units were racially segregated, and on ships, they were racially segregated, with blacks serving primarily in non-combat roles as mostly cooks, stewards, and survivors. But fortunately for the Intrepid, they decided to take a little chance and move ahead of the curve. The Intrepid decided to train a crew of black sailors on the 20-millimeter anti-aircraft gun. The crew would become Gun Tub 10. That is Mr. Dockery on top. That is Gun Tub 10. During normal operations, let's say during the day, these guys were stewards and cooks and servants. And during combat times, they would man the 20-millimeter anti-aircraft guns. In 1944, at age 38, James Dockery was 20 years older than most of every man in Gun Tub 10. And without question, he provided an element of stability and maturity to these young men who were fighting a war and were, for the first time in their lives, thousands of miles away from home. And then on October 29th, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a new and terrifying weapon bore down on the Intrepid, the dreaded kamikaze. As the Japanese suicide plane bore down on the ship, many of the gun tubs fled their battle stations. The men in Gun Tub 10 did not. As the plane drew closer, the men of Gun Tub 10, overcoming the instincts of human nature, remained at their post and fired at the plane methodically, first shearing off the left wing, then shooting off the tail, both of which fell harmlessly into the ocean. The ship had been saved from a direct hit, but unfortunately and tragically, the fuselage hit the deck. Skidded into Gun Tub 10. The results were horrific. 10 of the men of Gun Tub 10 were burned alive. 6 more were badly injured and burned. Eugene Smith, one of the members, was permanently blinded in one eye. Alonzo Swan was blown out of his perch, and Swan remembers a story which is horrible but not uncommon. He remembers badly injured, trying to crawl to save his friend who was on fire, and was begging him to shoot him. As he went to get his friend, ammunition exploded, and Swan was hurled away and knocked unconscious. James Dockery, too, was blown out of Gun Tub 10. He was badly burned and his leg badly injured. The surviving men, oddly enough, and ironically or coincidentally, one of the men who raced to Gun Tub 10 that day to evacuate the men, by the way, you can keep going, Colleen. One of the men who rushed to Gun Tub 10, if you would move forward, these are just on the right there, was 20-year-old Stamford resident, pharmacist mate, James Albert Winslow. Winslow helped to evacuate the men, and he would go on to earn the Silver Star later, and then also the Navy Cross. And then within a month, he would be tragically killed by another kamikaze that killed 69 of the crew of the Intrepid. The heroic actions of the men of Gun Tub 10 had saved the Intrepid, but at a terrible cost. Once again, in imminent danger, can't stress this enough, with a suicide plane bearing down on them, these gunners had stayed at their post as this plane was headed directly at them. As a result of their actions, Captain Joseph Bolger recommended the 6 surviving crewmen, Alonzo Swan, James Dockery, Eugene Smith, Eli Benjamin, Harold Clark Jr., Hugh Smith, and Janelle Copeland, for the Navy Cross. The Navy Cross, by the way, is the second highest military decoration that an American can earn in combat. It's second only to the Medal of Honor. It is awarded for exceptional valor and courage and selfless devotion to duty in the face of great danger. Just to give you an idea, in the entire history of this country, there are somewhere around 3,500 medals of honor in all the history of this country. 35 medals of honor. There are only slightly more Navy Cross winners among the tens of millions of Americans who served their country during warfare. The following month, that is the Navy Cross. The following month, there was a ceremony aboard the Intrepid. I believe there is a picture. By the way, if you'd move back, if you go to the Intrepid, but if you go to the Intrepid, oh, go to the Intrepid today, the previous plaque, if you could just, that one right there, you will see they still have that plaque right, that stands right where the kamikaze plane hit. You can still see that, but I'm sorry for that diversion. The following month, there was a ceremony on board the Intrepid. That's, by the way, Eli Benjamin. He's being given a facsimile medal. They were given a facsimile medal and a certificate telling them that they had earned the Navy Cross. The New York Times wrote an article about it. They issued a press release. But then, without any warning and no explanation, someone in the Navy downgraded the medal to Bronze Star, which, by the way, is an incredible decoration. But they were recommended for the Navy Cross by the commander of that ship. The men protested, but were essentially told, look, move on. The Bronze Star is quite an award. In 1944, I saw that document. Christopher Shea showed me the commendation for the Navy Cross, and I was stunned. I was stunned. There is the commendation for the Navy Cross with the language about heroism and valor and gallantry. Someone took a pencil and drew it through Navy Cross and wrote in pencil, Bronze Star. That's how it happened. One can only wonder why that happened. I think, well, this happened to others. I spoke to many where medals were downgraded, but one has to wonder why that happened with the stroke of a pencil. For the next 50 years, the men of Gun Tub 10, like millions of other returning veterans, quietly returned home and resumed their lives as civilians. Like many American heroes, they didn't boast about what they did, and in fact, they didn't talk about it. Most didn't talk about it with their own family. James Dockery settled in Stamford. He raised a family, and he worked for over 35 years for Perkin-Elmer in Norwalk. Little did anyone know that this quiet, humble, unassuming man who walked the streets of Stamford and who fished at the Mill River. The little man, little nondescript man fishing. Little did they know that this was, in fact, in their midst, an authentic American hero who saved countless lives. Mr. Dockery quietly pursued the issue of the Navy Cross, but life and family intervened. During this time, and over the next 4 decades, Dockery's crewmate, Alonzo Swan, relentlessly continued his quest for the Navy Cross. Finally, his years of determination paid off. And in 1993, a federal court ordered the Navy to award Swan the Navy Cross. And in a ceremony aboard the Intrepid, Swan's quest for justice was realized. Now the search for James Dockery began. Both the advocate and Christopher Shea's office searched for him. They, in fact, reached out to me. They couldn't find him. And there was a reason they couldn't find him. He was in the critical care unit at St. Joseph's Medical, under the care of that gentleman right there, Dr. Hines. Thank you for being here, Dr. Hines. He was recovering for abdominal surgery. At age 87, he was in failing health, and it was questionable whether or not he would survive and be able to receive his Navy Cross. It was suggested the Navy Cross could be sent to St. Joseph's Hospital, and it could be awarded to him there. But Mr. Dockery said, oh no, I've waited 50 years for this. And finally, a ceremony above the Intrepid was planned as soon as he was physically able to receive it. So now the race began. Will he survive in time to receive this incredible honor? Finally, on April 5th, 1994, Bonnie, you have the actual snapshot. April 5th, 1994, Mr. Dockery, who in his own words willed himself back to health, stood aboard the Intrepid to right a 50-year wrong, admitting to others that he was not feeling well and accompanied by an army of naval doctors and medical staff from St. Joseph's Hospital, Dr. Hines. Mr. Dockery did not speak that day. Instead, in typical fashion, he let others do the talking. In an emotional ceremony and surrounded by family and friends and local school children, including this humble school teacher and his history class, several speakers paid tribute. Rear Admiral Gable pinned the Navy Cross on Mr. Dockery and added, "Mr. Dockery, this medal is a symbol of a debt that can only be recognized but never repaid." Also present was Zachary Fisher. Now, many of you won't know. He's in another group picture. We'll get to that. Many of you might have heard the name Fisher House. Fisher House. Zachary Fisher is a New York philanthropist who has raised tens of millions of dollars for the armed services for Fisher House. Fisher House are these houses. Oh, she's skipped. Fisher House boards families who are visiting a critically wounded American veterans. A few years earlier, when Mr. Fisher heard that the Intrepid was about to be scrapped, he stepped in and he established the Intrepid Sea and Air and Space Museum. What was another $10 or $12 million? He said. When it was his turn to speak, Mr. Fisher talked about how, from the time he was a young boy, he reveled in the accomplishments of the Intrepid. He followed its progress and he followed its exploits throughout the Pacific. The mythical Intrepid. And he said it was a ship that simply he would not allow to be scrapped. So when it was Mr. Fisher's term, summed up the day perfectly. He turned to Mr. Dockery and he said, 1944, a young James Dockery saved this ship for all of us so that 50 years later, I could save this ship for him. Mr. Dockery, now we're even. One of the great lines of the day. And you see pictures with his family, and again, we're understating how ill he was that day. And he summoned all of his courage just to stand for this. He survived. He survived that day. He survived serious medical issues. He received the Navy Cross, but his health continued to decline. And in April of 1996, after fighting valiantly with a long illness, he died at the age of 89. Given a full military funeral, the honor guard. Reverend Robert Spain described him as a bold soldier of the Lord, bold soldier for his country. He was humble enough to know that the crown he was working for was not of this world, said Reverend Spain. He was laid to rest and is buried today at St. John's Cemetery on the Stamford Darien line. Throughout his long wait for justice, he remained quiet but resolute, and his belief that his day would come and his destiny will be fulfilled was unshaken. When asked about the long wait, he responded with one simple word: patience. In talking with Mr. Dockery's family members, none remember him uttering a single word about his experiences in World War II. In fact, none had any idea that he had earned the Navy Cross, and none had any idea that he had been denied its bestowal for so long. Like many of the authentic American heroes that I've been honored to meet over these last 40 years. Mr. Dockery preferred instead to move forward with his life, forget about the horrors of war, try and make his community a better place, and those around him better for having known him. James Dockery epitomizes the qualities that have made this nation great. He embodies all of the virtues: character, fortitude, courage, humility, loyalty, love of country, all of these that have allowed our democracy to not only survive, but flourish. In sum, he remains an extraordinary patriot, a patriot who demonstrated his love of country, not loudly, not by wrapping himself in the American flag, not by grandiose, visible affirmations of loyalty. Rather, he demonstrated his patriotism the only way he knew how: quietly, by his actions on October 29th, 1944, and his actions each and every day until his death. I'd love to return to Stamford someday. This is shameless what I'm about to do. Love to return to Stamford someday, which has had quite a legacy of honoring and valuing its military heroes. Love to return and see Mr. Dockery's name somewhere, on a street, on a building, on a room, on a plaque, in a place like Nerney Street, honoring Mary Nerney, the hero nurse of World War I, or Homer Lee Wise, recipient of the Medal of Honor, or Samuel Tresser Boulevard, named after Samuel Tresser, or DePretta Park, named after James DePretta in World War II, Douglas Northrop, the Little League field, named after Douglas Northrop, a hero pilot who was killed in the Second World War, or Brian Bill Memorial Highway, honoring a generational hero, second to none. This would be a place where children could see his name and ask, who is that? Who is that man? What did he do? And then they could be reminded of his great courage, and they could be told precisely what he did. And it's important because he represents the very best of this great city, and his story should never be forgotten. Mr. Dockery is the quintessential, quiet American hero, and above all, an extraordinary patriot. A common, humble, ordinary man who, when it mattered the most, became extraordinary. Thank you all for coming out tonight.